Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to explore one of the most discussed and controversial topics in recent history, the Israeli Navy's repeated actions of stopping humanitarian flotillas on their way to Gaza. This subject has raised debates all around the world. It involves politics, security concerns, humanitarian needs, international law, and the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The story of these flotillas is not just about ships on the sea, but about people, intentions, and the struggle between narratives that compete for legitimacy in the eyes of the global community. The blockade of Gaza has been in place since 2007, after Hamas took control of the territory. Israel, along with Egypt, imposed restrictions on movement of goods and people, arguing that it was necessary to prevent weapons from reaching armed groups. Critics, however, have called the blockade collective punishment, claiming that it impacts ordinary civilians more than fighters. This blockade created the backdrop for the launch of humanitarian flotillas, groups of ships organized by activists, NGOs, and international figures who wanted to deliver aid and challenge the restrictions. The first flotillas drew major media attention because they symbolized resistance against what many perceived as an unjust blockade. Activists from various countries, including Europe, Asia, and North America, came together to participate. These missions were not only about delivering food, medicine, and essential supplies, but also about making a political statement. Organizers wanted to shine a spotlight on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The symbolism of ships carrying aid across the Mediterranean was powerful. It showed determination, solidarity, and defiance in the face of naval power. The Israeli Navy, however, viewed these flotillas differently. From their perspective, letting ships through unchecked posed a direct security threat. Israel insisted that any aid could be delivered through official crossings once it was inspected for weapons or materials that could be used for military purposes. The flotillas, therefore, were seen not only as attempts to deliver aid, but also as political provocations meant to undermine Israel's sovereignty and security measures. This clash of perspectives set the stage for confrontations at sea. The most infamous incident occurred in May 2010 with the Mavi Marmara, part of a six-ship convoy organized by the Free Gaza movement and the Turkish NGO IHH. When Israeli commandos boarded the vessel in international waters, violent clashes broke out. 9 activists were killed during the raid, and dozens were injured. One more later died from wounds. The event sparked outrage across the world. Turkey, a key NATO member, cut diplomatic ties with Israel for years. The United Nations launched an investigation. Public opinion shifted, with many calling the incident a massacre, while Israel defended its soldiers, saying they acted in self-defense after being attacked with pipes, knives, and other weapons found on board. This incident transformed the way the world viewed humanitarian flotillas. For activists, it was proof that Israel would use lethal force to maintain its blockade. For Israel, it was proof that flotillas were not purely humanitarian, but carried risks of violent confrontation. The result was a global debate about proportionality, legitimacy, and morality. The video footage from the raid circulated widely, fueling anger and sympathy depending on one's political stance. In the years that followed, more flotillas attempted to reach Gaza, but none matched the scale of the Mavi Marmara incident. Israel continued to intercept them at sea. Ships were diverted to Israeli ports, their cargo inspected, and activists detained before being deported. Each attempt reignited discussions, but the pattern became predictable. The Israeli Navy maintained dominance at sea, while activists highlighted the symbolism of their efforts rather than actual deliveries of aid. The humanitarian argument remained central. Gaza's population faced shortages of medicine, clean water, electricity, and construction materials. International organizations repeatedly described conditions as dire, warning of humanitarian catastrophe. Activists believed that challenging the blockade directly through flotillas was a way to keep global attention on Gaza. They knew that even if aid did not reach its destination, the publicity surrounding their attempts would spark dialogue. Israel, on the other hand, consistently emphasized security. Rockets fired by Hamas and other groups from Gaza into Israeli cities reinforced the argument that materials could be diverted for military use. The Israeli government maintained that humanitarian supplies could be transferred through official crossings under inspection. They argued that flotillas ignored these legal channels intentionally to create confrontation. The tension here lies in the clash between humanitarian intentions and security concerns. Both sides claim legitimacy, and the truth often depends on political perspective. Supporters of the flotillas argue that international law allows ships to sail freely, especially if they are delivering humanitarian goods. They question Israel's right to enforce a blockade on waters not under its sovereignty. Critics of the flotillas argue that organizers use humanitarian language as a cover for political activism, sometimes backed by groups hostile to Israel. Beyond legality, the issue touches on morality. Should a civilian population of more than 2 million people be subjected to restrictions that make daily life a struggle? Should a state surrounded by threats be forced to take risks by allowing unchecked ships into a territory controlled by a group that openly opposes its existence? These are not easy questions, and they are the reason this topic continues to spark debate more than a decade later. The international response has always been mixed. Some governments condemned Israel's actions and supported the activists. Others, while critical of the blockade, recognized Israel's security concerns and avoided direct confrontation. The United States has generally supported Israel's right to defend itself at sea, while European countries have expressed stronger sympathy for the humanitarian cause. The United Nations has often called for lifting the blockade while also acknowledging Israel's security challenges. Public opinion around the world often leaned toward the flotillas, largely because images of civilian activists being stopped by military ships created a sense of imbalance. When small vessels filled with aid were blocked by one of the region's most powerful navies, the power contrast became a story in itself. Activists framed their mission as David versus Goliath, while Israel framed it as law enforcement against illegal provocations. The broader significance of the flotillas is that they symbolize the inability of international diplomacy to resolve the Gaza crisis. Activists stepped in because they felt governments and international institutions had failed. The repeated attempts, despite predictable outcomes, showed how strongly people felt about the need to challenge the blockade. At the same time, the naval interceptions demonstrated how determined Israel was to prevent any breach of its restrictions. Over the years, flotillas became smaller and less frequent, but the debate they sparked has not disappeared. Instead, the story has evolved into a case study of how non-governmental actors, activists, and civil society movements can influence international discourse. Even without delivering large amounts of aid, they managed to highlight a humanitarian crisis and keep it in the spotlight. For Israel, these incidents provided opportunities to demonstrate its military capability and its willingness to enforce policy consistently. But they also created diplomatic costs. Each raid, interception, or arrest drew attention and criticism. The balance between maintaining security and managing international image became a delicate challenge. The flotilla story also illustrates the power of media in shaping perception. Videos, images, and testimonies shared online created emotional responses across the globe. People who might not have paid attention to the blockade before suddenly became aware of it through the lens of dramatic confrontations at sea. Activists leveraged this media attention deliberately, knowing that visibility could be as valuable as the aid itself. Meanwhile, Gaza remains a place of humanitarian concern. Despite partial easing of restrictions over the years, conditions for residents remain difficult. Limited access to clean water electricity shortages, unemployment, and poverty continue to define daily life. The flotillas were one attempt to address this situation, but they were not a permanent solution. They were more of a protest, a symbolic act rather than a sustainable answer to the needs of 2 million people. At the heart of this issue lies a broader conflict that has resisted resolution for decades. The flotillas are just one episode in the ongoing struggle between Israelis and Palestinians, between security and freedom, between sovereignty and humanitarian rights. They remind us that conflicts are not only fought with weapons, but also with symbols, activism, and public opinion. Looking back now, years after the peak of the flotilla movement, it is clear that they succeeded in keeping Gaza on the global agenda. They forced international leaders to respond, they ignited debates in parliaments and in living rooms, and they showed how civil society could confront state power. At the same time, they also highlighted the limits of activism when faced with military enforcement and geopolitical realities. Some critics argue that the flotillas only deepened divisions and hardened Israel's resolve to maintain the blockade. Others argue that without them, the world might have forgotten Gaza entirely. Both perspectives carry truth. What cannot be denied is that these maritime confrontations left a mark on history. When analyzing these events, it is important to understand the complexity of the conflict. Neither side exists in isolation. For Israel, security threats are real. For Palestinians in Gaza, daily hardships are real. The flotillas became a theater where both narratives collided on the waves of the Mediterranean. They offered no ultimate solution, but they revealed the depth of the problem. Even today, the legacy of these flotillas lingers. New generations of activists study them as examples of nonviolent resistance, while governments study them as challenges to maritime law and sovereignty. The debate they sparked continues in universities, international forums, and media outlets. They remain symbols of confrontation between power and protest. As we reflect on this subject, it is important to go beyond simple slogans or one-sided arguments. The truth lies in the recognition that both security and humanitarian needs matter. Ignoring one side of the equation only fuels more division. A long-term solution requires addressing the root causes of the blockade, the conflict, and the mistrust that has built up over decades. The flotillas remind us that even in the age of advanced diplomacy, ordinary people and civil groups can play roles that shape global narratives. They show how sea voyages meant to carry supplies can also carry messages that reach far beyond their intended destinations. They demonstrate that in conflicts, symbols are sometimes as powerful as weapons. As the world continues to watch developments in Gaza and the broader region, the flotillas stand as a chapter that cannot be ignored. They may not have ended the blockade, but they ensured that the blockade remained a subject of global discussion. That in itself was a form of victory for the activists. For Israel, the ability to enforce its policies consistently at sea was also a demonstration of strength. The outcome is a stalemate, but one that continues to echo. In conclusion, the story of the humanitarian flotillas stopped by the Israeli Navy is not just about ships and sailors. It is about politics, human rights, international law, and the struggle of narratives. It shows us the complexity of a conflict that has no simple solution. It challenges us to think about the balance between security and humanitarian needs, and it reminds us that in the modern world, even small groups of activists can create waves that are felt across the globe.